Our legacy belongs to the one who truly earned it. That's what my father Hector announced, standing at the head of our mahogany dining table. 50 prominent Rhode Island guests, local politicians, hospital board executives, and coastal marina owners all raised their crystal champagne flutes in unison. At his right hand, bathed in the warm golden glow of a tiered chandelier, sat my older sister, Camilla. Hector smiled a practiced, camera-ready expression he reserved for high society functions. Tonight, I am proud to formally name Camilla the sole heir and managing partner of Ruiz Maritime. The room broke into roaring applause. My mother Isabel dabbed the corners of her eyes with a monogrammed linen napkin, timing her tears perfectly, just as the hired photographer snapped a candid shot. Camilla beamed, her tailored silk gown shimmering as she leaned into her husband, soaking up the unearned admiration of Rhode Island's wealthiest families. I sat at the far end of the room, near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, wearing a stiff, off-the-rack navy dress. I didn't raise a glass. I didn't clap. I just traced the rim of my water goblet and watched the performance play out. I let them toast. I let them bask in the warmth of their perceived victory. When the servers emerged to clear the plates, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of wood against the marble floor went unnoticed by the crowd. I slipped through the heavy French doors, escaping the stifling perfume-heavy air of the mansion, and stepped into the crisp November night. The salty bite of the Atlantic wind whipped across my face, carrying the faint, familiar scent of brine from Narragansett Bay. I walked down the long cobblestone driveway, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic march in the dark. Parked near the wrought iron security gates, its engine idling to a low hum, sat a black sedan. As I approached, the driver's side door swung open. Anthony Mercer, a corporate attorney from Boston, stepped onto the gravel. His breath plumed in the cold air. He didn't offer a sympathetic smile. He didn't ask how the dinner was going. He simply reached into the passenger seat and handed me a thick, heavy red folder. The physical weight of it in my hands felt profound. It held the culmination of months of silence. Before I tell you what was printed on the certified legal stock inside that folder, and how it turned a multi-million-dollar coronation into a spectacular collapse of egos, take a second to hit like and subscribe to Jessica Told Stories. Do it only if you've ever been the invisible workhorse in your own family, the one expected to carry the heavy lifting while someone else wears the crown. Drop your city and the local time in the comments below. My name is Elena Ruiz. I'm 31 years old, working as a healthcare data analyst up in Providence. What you are about to hear is not a temper tantrum. It is a forensic audit. And this is how I legally dismantled a family that tried to bury me. To understand the explosion you just witnessed, you have to understand the foundation it destroyed. Rhode Island might be the smallest state in the Union, but Narragansett Bay operates on a massive, invisible caste system. Where I grew up, your zip code and your pedigree dictate your worth before you even open your mouth. My parents, Hector and Isabel, built an empire out of that exact snobbery. They owned a network of high-end seafood restaurants and private marina charters specifically designed to cater to the wealthy tourists summering in Newport. They sold an illusion of old money and maritime luxury. But the true sailor in our family, the person who actually built the hull of our legacy, was my late grandmother Rosa. I can still feel the splintered wood of the docks beneath my sneakers. I was 10 years old. The air tasted heavy with salt diesel fuel and the sharp tang of gutted flounder. While my mother was busy picking out linen napkins for the flagship restaurant, Rosa had me down by the trawlers with a rusted clipboard. Her hands were rough, weathered like driftwood, and she smelled of black coffee and sea spray. She taught me how to read the shipping manifests, how to calculate the gross tonnage of the daily catch, and how to spot a supplier skimming off the top. She pointed a calloused finger at the churning gray water and told me something I tattooed on my brain. The ocean does not care about your last name, Elena. It only respects who knows how to navigate. She did not care about country club memberships or social standing. She cared about the work. When Rosa passed away, a piece of the company's soul died with her. My parents immediately took the reins and steered Ruiz Maritime away from its working-class roots, directly into the arms of the elite. With the rebrand came the grooming of their chosen successor. My parents molded my older sister Camila into the loud, charismatic face of the brand. She was 3 years older, blessed with my mother's tall frame and my father's booming, effortless charm. While I inherited Rosa's quiet intensity, Camila inherited the spotlight. I remember Friday nights during my teenage years perfectly. The house would smell of expensive hairspray and imported perfume. My mother would spend hours pinning Camila into designer gowns for the annual yacht club galas, lecturing her on which local politician to flatter and which real estate developer to charm. Camila was the jewel of the Ruiz family. I was the ghost in the hallway. I stayed in my bedroom, the glow of a computer monitor washing over my face, teaching myself how to run pivot tables and build financial projection models. Nobody knocked on my door to ask how my day went. Nobody bought me designer dresses. I told myself it did not matter. I convinced myself that substance would eventually outshine style. By the time I turned 25, the dynamic had solidified into concrete. I moved out, got a modest apartment in Providence, and secured a demanding job as a healthcare data analyst for a sprawling regional hospital network. I spent my days analyzing patient outcomes, streamlining billing inefficiencies, and drowning in statistics. I was highly skilled at my job. I made my own money and built my own independent life. But the gravitational pull of the Ruiz family is impossible to escape. Every Friday evening, after working a grueling 50-hour week at the hospital, I would drive down the coast to my parents' estate. I did not go for family dinners or warm reunions. I went to do the back-end accounting for Ruiz Maritime. For free. My father despised numbers. He called them tedious and beneath his visionary status as a founder. So I balanced the ledgers, filed the state tax preparations, and managed the payroll. I spent my weekends untangling the financial messes my father created during his schmoozing lunches. The friction started building during a particularly brutal fiscal quarter. The company was hemorrhaging cash due to inflated fuel costs across the charter fleet. I stayed up for 3 consecutive nights in my cramped apartment, my eyes burning from the screen glare, cross-referencing fuel consumption logs with our supplier invoices. I found a staggering inefficiency, restructured the entire vendor supply chain, and drafted a new routing protocol that saved Ruiz Maritime nearly $80,000 in a single month. I printed the report, placed it in a sleek binder, and left it on my father's desk, feeling a rare surge of pride. I thought this would be the moment they finally looked at me and realized I was the one keeping the ship afloat. The following Sunday, we sat around the dining table. Hector raised a glass of expensive scotch, his face flushed with triumph. He looked right past me and locked eyes with my sister. He praised Camilla for her brilliant logistical overhaul. He thanked her for modernizing the company and saving the quarter. Camilla smiled a perfect, practiced curve of her lips and accepted the praise without missing a single beat. She even laughed gracefully, joking about how exhausting the research had been for her. I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white. The ambient noise of the room faded into a dull ring in my ears. My mother beamed at Camila, her eyes shining with absolute adoration. I opened my mouth to speak, to claim my own sleepless nights and my own hard work, but the heavy, suffocating weight of their shared delusion stopped the words in my throat. Camila took all the credit for my operational turnarounds. She always did. They plastered her face on their promotional brochures and paraded her around as the brilliant young executive. I told myself it was fine. I swallowed the bitter taste of resentment and forced my hands to relax. I thought that keeping my head down, staying loyal, and proving my undeniable usefulness would eventually earn their genuine respect. I thought they would wake up one day, look at the numbers, and finally see me. I was entirely wrong. Toxic families do not reward silent loyalty. They exploit it. They view your quiet competence as a resource to be mined until you are hollow. And that desperate, lingering childhood need to be seen was exactly what my father used to lead me straight into a financial trap, one that would hold my entire future hostage for the next 4 years. That exploitation did not begin with a loud argument or a sudden betrayal. It started with a quiet, desperate plea for help. 4 years ago, my father decided that catering to the Newport elite was no longer enough. He wanted to own their playground. Hector went on a reckless spending spree, purchasing 2 custom Italian luxury yachts to expand our private charter fleet. I remember seeing the glossy brochures scattered across his mahogany desk. They featured sleek white fiberglass, polished teakwood decks, and champagne chillers built directly into the hull. They were beautiful floating liabilities. He financed both vessels on a dangerous margin, betting that a record-breaking tourist season would cover the debt. The season ended up being unseasonably cold and rainy. By October, the corporate accounts were drained. The commercial banks looked at his upside-down debt-to-income ratio and slammed their heavy vault doors in his face. He was drowning. His golden child, Camilla, possessed 0 financial literacy and could not throw him a life preserver. He needed someone with an immaculate record. He needed his invisible daughter. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon. A dinner reservation at a premier, dimly lit steakhouse in downtown Providence. The air inside smelled of seared ribeye, expensive Cabernet, and old money. Hector wore a tailored charcoal suit, but sitting across from him, I noticed the subtle fraying of his shirt cuffs and the nervous sweat gathering at his temples. Isabel sat beside him, rigidly twisting her diamond wedding band around her finger. They did not ask about my grueling shifts at the hospital. They did not ask about my personal life. They ordered my meal for me, a subtle assertion of lifelong control, and then Hector slid a thick manila folder across the crisp, white linen tablecloth. Inside was a 7-figure commercial bridge loan. He needed a pristine cosigner to secure the financing that would keep Ruiz Maritime from collapsing into bankruptcy. I stared at the bold print on the signature page. The numbers made my stomach tighten. It was a sum of debt that could crush a normal person for decades. Isabel reached across the table, knocking over the salt shaker in her haste. Her manicured fingers clamped down on my wrists. Her grip was tight, desperate, and devoid of any real maternal warmth. "It is just for 12 months, Elena," she pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. "We will refinance before next summer, and your name comes right off the paperwork. You are saving the family. We literally cannot survive this without you." That last sentence was the bait. For 27 years, they had operated as though my existence was merely incidental. Now I was the keystone holding up their entire world. I had spent my early 20s building a flawless credit score, paying off my student loans years early, and hoarding my analyst salary in high-yield savings accounts. I possessed the one currency Camila lacked. I wanted to be the hero. I wanted my parents to look at me the way they looked at my sister. I picked up the heavy brass pen Hector eagerly offered. I signed the dotted lines. In doing so, I became their literal bridge, a solid, dependable structure designed specifically for them to walk all over to reach safety, while I absorbed the crushing weight of their luxury lifestyle. 12 months evaporated into thin air, then 24, then 36. Every single time I brought up the refinancing, their excuses morphed into a new flavor of avoidance. The federal interest rates were too punishing. The current tourist season was unusually slow. The rising diesel prices were eating into their operational margins. Hector would wave his hand dismissively, promising he was scheduling a meeting with the commercial brokers next week. Isabel would sigh heavily, accusing me of lacking faith in my own flesh and blood. 4 years passed. My credit remained chained to a commercial entity I did not own. The reality of that financial hostage situation hit me when I tried to carve out a small piece of independence for myself. I found a modest 2-bedroom townhouse in Warwick. It had scuffed oak floors, a bay window facing a quiet suburban street, and a tiny backyard where I could finally drink my morning coffee in peace. I put in an offer. The mortgage underwriter pulled my file and immediately flagged the Ruiz Maritime Bridge loan. My debt-to-income ratio, tied directly to Hector's sprawling corporate mess, disqualified me instantly. The bank denied my application within 24 hours. I sat in my parked car outside that beautiful Warwick townhouse and cried until my ribs physically ached. I was trapped in a cramped rented apartment while Camilla drove a brand-new company-leased Porsche Panamera down Ocean Drive. My signature was paying for her heated leather seats. During this 4-year holding pattern, another deep crack formed in the Ruiz facade. Hector enjoyed his expensive scotch. He enjoyed it entirely too much one evening after a yacht club regatta. He was pulled over on a winding coastal road by the state police. Through highly paid lawyers and local political favors, he managed to keep the incident out of the Rhode Island papers. But the State Maritime Commission does not care about your country club status. A mandatory suspension hit his record. His master commercial maritime licenses lapsed immediately. Without those active licenses tied to the company, the insurance premiums for our entire charter fleet would quadruple overnight, bankrupting the business before the bridge loan even matured. He summoned me to his home office on a rainy Sunday morning. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, expensive leather, and panic. He tossed a stack of state registry forms onto his desk, pushing them toward me. "I need you to put the fleet licenses in your name," he ordered, not even bothering to look up from his glowing laptop screen. "Just until my background check clears next spring." I hesitated, looking at the seal of the state government on the header. "Dad, those are state compliance documents. I do not run the boats. I run healthcare data." He let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "You are the data nerd, Elena. You handle the complicated state registry paperwork for the hospital all day long, do you not? It is just a bureaucratic technicality to satisfy the insurance vultures. Sign the bottom line, and I will have a courier take it to the Capitol tomorrow morning." He shoved his pen into my hand. He viewed the transfer as a meaningless administrative chore, a tiny hoop to jump through because he despised paperwork and consequences in equal measure. He had no idea what he was actually doing. He was so intensely focused on covering up his own reckless behavior that he never bothered to read the foundational bylaws of the corporation his own mother founded. I signed the registry documents, legally transferring the master fleet licenses into my possession. To him, it was a clerical band-aid. To me, it would become the most vital signature of my entire existence. I walked out of his office that day carrying the heavy legal weight of the company on my shoulders, yet remaining entirely invisible to the people who depended on me for survival. I thought the worst of their exploitation was over. I assumed Hector's financial mismanagement was the ceiling of their deception. I did not realize they were about to bring someone new into the fold. Someone who looked like a Kennedy, talked like a seasoned politician, and possessed a moral compass broken beyond repair. Camilla was getting married, and her new husband was about to teach me that my family was not just careless with money. They were actively harboring a thief. The fragile ecosystem of our family shifted entirely the day Camilla introduced us to her future husband. Jason possessed the kind of effortless, aristocratic posture that only generations of unearned wealth can produce. He had sweeping blonde hair, a practiced golf swing, and a last name that decorated half the historic bronze plaques in downtown Newport. My parents were immediately captivated. To them, Jason was not just a son-in-law, he was a strategic acquisition. He represented the final elusive puzzle piece they needed to legitimize their ascent into Rhode Island high society. They threw a wedding reception that rivaled a royal coronation, serving imported caviar and vintage champagne under sprawling white canvas tents on the yacht club lawn. I sat at a back table, watching Hector write a staggering check to cover the catering costs, quietly wondering how our already suffocating debt could endure another heavy blow. What my parents refused to see, and what anyone with a basic understanding of local gossip already knew, was that Jason carried a legendary surname attached to a hollowed-out bank account. His family had secretly gone broke a decade prior, losing their trust funds to bad real estate investments and aggressive tax penalties. Jason wore custom-tailored suits, but he drove a leased car and lived in a carriage house owned by his aging aunt. He was a masterclass in projection. My father, blinded by the blinding allure of old money, ignored every glaring red flag and immediately hired him as the director of vendor relations for Ruiz Maritime. Jason had zero supply chain experience. His only discernible qualification was his ability to order a gin martini without looking at the cocktail menu. The dynamic at the corporate office mutated overnight. Before Jason arrived, my weekend accounting sessions were solitary, quiet hours spent wrestling with Hector's disorganized receipts. Now, I had to untangle a web of vague expense reports generated by a man who treated the company ledger like a personal slush fund. Jason spent his Tuesday afternoons entertaining potential clients at the golf course, expensing lavish steak dinners and premium cigars, while claiming he was negotiating better rates with our seafood distributors. Whenever I questioned a missing receipt, he would flash a condescending bright smile, pat me on the shoulder, and tell me not to worry my pretty head about high-level executive strategy. He treated me like a glorified administrative assistant, despite the fact that my signature on the state master licenses was the only thing keeping the fleet legally operational. I swallowed the indignity because I still believed my sacrifice would eventually be recognized. I still believed the numbers would ultimately speak louder than his pedigree. The numbers did speak, but they delivered a message far more sinister than simple corporate incompetence. 6 months ago, the fragile bridge I had built for my family began to fracture. I received a registered letter at my apartment in Providence. The envelope bore the austere embossed logo of the commercial bank holding our bridge loan. My hands shook slightly as I tore open the seal. It was a formal notice of impending default. The company had missed 2 consecutive payment cycles. If the arrears were not cleared within 60 days, the bank would initiate asset seizure protocols and destroy my credit score in the process. Panic surged hot and fast through my chest. I immediately called Hector, demanding a swift explanation. My father dismissed my anxiety with a wave of his hand through the phone, claiming it was merely a temporary cash flow hiccup caused by an unusually sluggish early summer season. He promised the accountants were shifting funds and that I needed to stop acting so hysterical. But I am a healthcare data analyst. I spend 40 hours a week tracking systemic failures and financial leakage across a sprawling hospital network. I know exactly what a struggling balance sheet looks like, and Ruiz Maritime had enjoyed a record-breaking spring. The harbor had been packed with tourists. The private charters were booked solid. The revenue was entering the business, but it was vanishing before it hit the debt servicing accounts. I did not sleep that Friday night. I brewed a large pot of dark roast coffee, sat at my small kitchen table, and opened my encrypted laptop. I logged into the Ruiz Maritime backend servers and initiated a comprehensive line-by-line audit of the current fiscal year. I bypassed the summary dashboards Hector liked to glance at and dove straight into the raw, unfiltered general ledger. The digital spreadsheet stretched across my dual monitors, a dense matrix of dates, routing numbers, and vendor invoices. It took me less than an hour to locate the bleed. The hemorrhage was concentrated entirely within the vendor relations department, Jason's department. I pulled up the billing statements for marine diesel fuel and hull maintenance. These were our largest operational expenses, requiring constant financial output to keep the luxury yachts functioning. I cross-referenced our historical data from the previous 3 years against the current quarter. The discrepancy was glaring. The invoices approved by Jason were inflated by roughly 40%. We were suddenly paying astronomical premiums for basic routine maintenance and bulk diesel purchases, yet the physical usage logs from the dockmasters showed zero increase in activity. The boats were running the exact same routes, consuming the exact same amount of fuel. But the company was bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. My analytical brain took over, replacing fear with cold, mechanical precision. Because tracing missing funds is a fundamental part of my actual profession, it took me exactly 3 hours to dissect Jason's entire scheme. I isolated the inflated invoices and tracked the payment routing numbers. The excess payments were not going to our established maritime suppliers in Newport. Instead, the funds were being diverted to a newly registered third-party logistics firm. I opened a new browser tab and searched the Rhode Island Secretary of State corporate database. I typed in the name of this mysterious logistics firm. The results loaded on my screen, casting a harsh blue glow across my face. It was a shell company, a limited liability corporation registered to a nondescript post office box in Cranston. There was no warehouse, no fleet of delivery trucks, and no physical office. There was only a registered agent listed on the Articles of Organization. The name matching the registered agent was a local attorney who specialized in discreet wealth management for prominent Newport families. The exact same attorney Jason used for his personal estate planning. I exported the bank transfer logs and ran a final sum on my calculator application. The digital numbers stared back at me, a cold, undeniable verdict. Over the span of 2 years, my golden boy brother-in-law had quietly embezzled over $200,000 from Ruiz Maritime. He had set up a dummy corporation, artificially inflated our primary operating expenses, and funneled the excess cash directly into his own pockets. This was why the bridge loan could not be paid. This was why my credit was teetering on the edge of destruction. Jason was systematically draining the company to fund his country club memberships, his leased luxury cars, and his carefully curated illusion of generational wealth. I sat alone in the quiet darkness of my apartment, listening to the hum of my refrigerator clutching a stack of printed spreadsheets. The betrayal was so profound, it made the air feel thin. I was sacrificing my youth, my financial independence, and my peace of mind to keep a sinking ship afloat, while the man my parents worshipped was actively drilling holes in the hull. I knew in that exact moment that passive observation was no longer an option. I had the raw data in my hands, a weapon forged from indisputable mathematics. I gathered the ledgers, shoved them into a thick manila envelope, and grabbed my car keys. It was time to show my parents the true cost of their social climbing. I drove toward the coast as the sun began to rise, expecting Hector to erupt in righteous fury at the man stealing from his legacy. entirely unprepared for the reality that his anger would be aimed directly at me. The drive from Providence to Newport takes about 45 minutes when the morning commuter traffic is light. I kept the radio off the entire way. The only sound inside my sedan was the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt and the quiet rustle of the thick manila envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside me. That envelope held 50 pages of printed financial ledgers, bank routing numbers, and state registry filings. It held the undeniable proof of Jason and his Cranston Shell Company. As I crossed the Jamestown-Verrazano Bridge, the fog was still burning off the dark waters of Narragansett Bay. I felt a strange sense of calm washing over me. For my entire life, I had been the overlooked ghost in the Ruiz family. But today, I was arriving as their savior. I was bringing them the exact reason their business was failing, handing them the lifeline they desperately needed to save the bridge loan. I genuinely believed that once Hector saw the raw data, the illusion of his perfect son-in-law would shatter. I expected righteous anger. I expected him to summon his lawyers, press charges, and finally look at me with the respect I had spent 31 years trying to earn. I pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of my parents' estate. The tires crunched over the pristine white gravel driveway, a stark contrast to the modest asphalt parking lot of my apartment building. I walked through the heavy oak front doors without knocking. The house smelled of fresh eucalyptus and lemon polish. It was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. I bypassed the formal living rooms and marched directly toward the east wing where my father kept his private study. Hector sat behind his polished mahogany desk, nursing a cup of black coffee while scrolling through a tablet. He wore a crisp linen shirt, looking every bit the relaxed coastal patriarch. He did not look up when I entered. He merely waved a hand, gesturing for me to sit on the leather sofa near the window. I bypassed the sofa. I walked straight to his desk and dropped the heavy manila envelope onto the center of his blotter. The sharp thud echoed in the quiet room. He finally raised his head, his brow furrowing in irritation. He despised interruptions, especially ones involving paperwork. I did not wait for him to ask. I kept my voice level and professional, utilizing the exact tone I used during quarterly board meetings at the hospital. I laid out the facts. I explained the 40% inflation on the marine fuel invoices. I traced the unauthorized payments flowing directly from our operational accounts into the dummy logistics firm. I handed him the printed corporate registration from the state database highlighting the name of Jason and his personal estate attorney. I laid the entire $200,000 theft bare in less than 3 minutes. Hector picked up his reading glasses from the edge of the desk. He slid them onto the bridge of his nose and picked up the top sheet of paper. I stood there, my heart thudding a steady rhythm against my ribs, waiting for the inevitable eruption. I waited for him to slam his fist on the desk. I waited for him to reach for his phone to call the police. Instead, a suffocating silence settled over the study. I watched his eyes scan the rows of numbers. I watched the realization dawn on him. But the reaction that followed defied every logical expectation I held. The dark flush creeping up his neck did not signal outrage directed at the thief. The muscles in his jaw tightened, grinding together as he slowly lowered the papers back onto the desk. He took off his glasses. When he looked up at me, his eyes were cold, hard, and devoid of gratitude. "How dare you hack into our private vendor files?" he demanded. His voice was low, possessing a dangerous edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. I blinked, momentarily, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of his question. "I did not hack anything," I replied, keeping my posture rigid. "I used my authorized access to conduct the weekend audit you asked me to do. Jason is stealing from the company. The money you need to pay the commercial loan is sitting in a Cranston post office box." "You are snooping where you do not belong," Hector countered, standing up. He leaned over the desk, using his physical presence to cast a shadow over me. You are a data analyst at a hospital, Elena. You are not a forensic accountant. You do not understand the complexities of high-level maritime logistics or vendor negotiation. The sound of sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor broke my concentration. Isabel glided into the study, clutching a silk morning robe tightly around her waist. She had heard the raised voices. Her gaze darted from the scattered spreadsheets on the desk to my face, quickly assessing the threat level in the room. Hector did not hesitate. He pointed a finger at me and told my mother that I was actively trying to frame Camilla and her new husband for corporate fraud. Isabel did not look at the papers. She did not need to see the math. She immediately deployed her favorite and most devastating weapon. Her lower lip began to tremble. Her eyes pooled with instantaneous performative tears. She pressed a hand to her chest, inhaling a sharp, jagged breath meant to signal deep maternal heartbreak. "You have always envied Camilla," she sobbed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You have spent your entire life resenting her success. You cannot stand that she found a good husband, a man from a respectable family. So you are fabricating data to destroy her marriage." I stood paralyzed, staring at the woman who gave birth to me. I pointed at the state registry document sitting mere inches from her hand. The proof is right there in black and white. It is a shell company. Jason is draining the accounts. We are going to default on the bridge loan. Isabel stepped closer to Hector, linking her arm through his, presenting a united front of willful ignorance. She shook her head, letting a single tear slip down her cheek. "You are sick, Elena," she whispered, injecting a tone of profound pity into her words. "You are letting your bitterness turn you into a toxic, paranoid person. We will not let you tear this family apart with your jealousy." The psychological whiplash nearly knocked me off balance. I looked back and forth between them, searching for any trace of reason. And then, peering through the thick fog of their gaslighting, I finally saw the truth. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. They understood the numbers. Hector knew how to read a balance sheet. He knew I was right. But acknowledging the truth required them to confront a reality far more terrifying than bankruptcy. Admitting Jason was a thief meant admitting they had been conned. It meant confessing to the entire Newport Country Club circuit that they had handed the keys of their empire to a faux aristocrat with a hollow bank account. It would expose them as desperate social climbers who were so eager to buy their way into historic Rhode Island high society that they let a charming grifter rob them blind. In their world, losing money was an unfortunate business cycle, but becoming a public laughingstock was a fatal wound. To protect their fragile pride, they made a calculated decision to sacrifice reality. They chose the parasite. Hector picked up his phone from the desk. He did not dial the police. He dialed the outsourced information technology firm that managed the Ruiz Maritime servers. He spoke in clipped, authoritative tones, instructing the technician to immediately revoke all of my administrative privileges, network passwords, and remote login capabilities. He severed my digital access to the company while I stood right in front of him. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the leather blotter. He gathered the spreadsheets I had stayed up all night compiling and shoved them back into the manila envelope. He thrust the envelope against my chest, forcing me to take it back. "You are no longer welcome to review our financials," Hector stated, his tone dripping with disdain. "And you are no longer welcome at Sunday dinners. Do not set foot on this property again until you are ready to issue a formal, written apology to Jason for this despicable witch hunt." I took the envelope. The paper felt heavy burdened with the weight of my wasted loyalty. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. Arguing with people committed to their own delusion is like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. I turned on my heel and walked out of the study, navigating the long hallways of the mansion I used to call home. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, sealing me out in the cold morning air. As I walked back to my car, the reality of my situation calcified in my chest. I had walked into that house believing I was their savior. I walked out, realizing I was their hostage. My credit was still chained to their failing commercial loan, and now I had zero visibility into the sinking ship. But far worse than the financial peril was the chilling realization of what they would do next. They had identified me as a threat to their social standing. People like Hector and Isabel do not just cut ties with threats. They neutralize them. By the time I turned the key in my ignition, my parents were already drafting the blueprint for a smear campaign designed to ensure that if I ever tried to speak the truth, no one in Rhode Island would ever believe me. That is when the whispers began to circulate. To truly comprehend the speed at which a reputation can disintegrate, you must understand the unique geography of Rhode Island. We inhabit the smallest state in the Union, a place that functions less like a sprawling geographic region and far more like a densely populated, interconnected city-state. Here, there are no true secrets, only delayed revelations. The social circles of Newport Luxury and Providence Healthcare intertwine like thick, knotted fishing nets. Everyone attends the same charity galas, sits on the same philanthropic boards, and drinks at the same exclusive yacht clubs. When a powerful family decides to excommunicate a rogue member, they do not merely lock their front door. They salt the earth. My mother understood this socio-political battlefield better than anyone. Isabel went on an immediate, highly calculated offensive to control the narrative before I could even process the shock of being banished from my father's study. She knew I worked as a data analyst for the largest regional hospital network in the state. She also knew that the executive board of my hospital relied heavily on the seasonal donations provided by wealthy maritime business owners. The execution of her smear campaign was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I heard the details a few days later from an old college acquaintance named Rachel, who possessed just enough lingering guilt to warn me. Picture a Sunday fundraising brunch for the pediatric oncology wing held on the manicured lawns of the Premier Country Club. Isabel wore a tasteful ivory cashmere sweater, gripping a glass of sparkling water with both hands to simulate subtle tremors of distress. She cornered the wife of my hospital's chief executive officer. Instead of expressing anger, Isabel deployed the most dangerous emotion available to a manipulative parent. She weaponized pity. Isabel dropped her voice to a theatrical, hushed murmur. She shook her head, letting her eyes fill with unshed tears. She told the surrounding circle of influential women that her youngest daughter was suffering through a severe mental health crisis. She painted a tragic portrait of a young woman buckling under the pressures of a demanding healthcare job, consumed by an irrational, paranoid jealousy of her older sister. "We are simply devastated," Isabel whispered, pressing a hand to her collarbone. "The specialists say it is a sudden psychological break. We are praying she accepts the psychiatric help she desperately needs." While my mother played the heartbroken matriarch to the older generation, Camila targeted the younger demographic. My sister utilized her upscale Pilates classes, tennis matches, and regatta after-parties to spread a far more venomous variation of the lie. Camila needed to explain away the inevitable rumors of financial instability surrounding the company, so she took my forensic audit and twisted it into a weapon of extortion. She told our mutual acquaintances that I had suffered a nervous breakdown, hacked into the private family servers, and fabricated a web of financial crimes. She claimed I demanded a massive cash payout to keep quiet, attempting to blackmail my own flesh and blood. Jason stood right beside her during these performances, wearing the tailored suit of a wrongly accused gentleman, shaking his head in feigned disbelief at my sheer cruelty. The freeze hit my professional life with breathtaking speed. On Monday morning, I walked into the hospital administrative building carrying my usual thermos of coffee. The atmosphere on my floor had shifted overnight. The ambient chatter in the break room evaporated the moment I crossed the threshold. Kelly, a project manager who usually spent 20 minutes complaining to me about her morning commute, suddenly found the tile floor incredibly fascinating. She offered a tight, uncomfortable nod and hurried back to her cubicle. The true damage manifested during my weekly departmental review. My direct supervisor, a senior director named Dr. Arrington, called me into his glass-walled office. He did not ask for my analysis on the latest billing efficiency reports. Instead, he treated me with the exaggerated, cautious gentleness one might use when approaching a volatile explosive. He informed me that he was reassigning my lead role on a high-profile data migration project, handing the responsibility to a junior analyst. When I demanded a professional justification for the sudden demotion, Dr. Arrington offered a deeply pitying look. He folded his hands on his desk and used soft, careful language. "We just want to ensure you have the necessary bandwidth to focus on your personal well-being right now," he said, his tone dripping with unearned sympathy. "Family transitions can be incredibly taxing on our mental reserves. Take the time you need to get healthy." The sting of that phrase radiated through my chest. The rumor had reached the executive suite. My professional credibility, the solitary pillar of independence I had built with my own hands, was actively crumbling under the weight of my mother's staged tears. My colleagues did not view me as a highly competent analyst anymore. They viewed me as a fragile, unhinged liability, teetering on the edge of a breakdown. The social isolation mirrored the professional exile. Old high school friends stopped returning my text messages. Invitations to weekend gatherings quietly ceased. I would walk through the grocery store aisles in my neighborhood and spot familiar faces abruptly turning their shopping carts down different aisles to avoid making eye contact. They were systematically boxing me into a corner, ensuring that if I ever tried to go public about Jason embezzling $200,000, or if I tried to explain the predatory bridge loan holding my credit hostage, the entire town would preemptively dismiss me. I would not be seen as a whistleblower reporting corporate fraud. I would be written off as a bitter, unstable liar acting out a petty family vendetta. I spent that entire weekend confined within the walls of my cramped, rented apartment. The silence in those rooms felt heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I sat on my faded sofa, staring at the blank television screen, tracing the cold reality of my situation. I was entirely alone. My signature was still legally bound to a commercial loan teetering on the edge of default. My golden boy brother-in-law was still siphoning cash out of the hull of the business, and my parents had successfully insulated themselves by burning my reputation to ash. It was a brilliant sociopathic strategy. It was a preemptive strike designed to strip me of my voice before I could even step up to the microphone. For a few dark hours, I let the despair win. I pulled my knees to my chest and allowed myself to grieve the family I never truly had. I mourned the realization that Hector and Isabel would gladly destroy my mind, my career, and my future just to protect their fragile illusion of Newport royalty. But grief is a finite resource. Eventually, the tears stopped falling, leaving behind a cold, hardened clarity. As the sun dipped below the Providence skyline, casting long shadows across my living room floor, my analytical training kicked back into gear. I wiped my face and opened my laptop. You cannot fight a sophisticated public relations war using emotion. You fight it using structural leverage. My parents wanted to wage a war over the ownership of Ruiz Maritime. They wanted to cast me out of the empire. But if I was going to dismantle their siege, I needed to understand the exact composition of the fortress they were defending. I needed to stop looking at the current corrupted data and start examining the historical archives. I needed to look past Hector's inflated ego and investigate the original architect of our legacy. I needed to find out exactly how Grandmother Rosa built the company 30 years ago, and more importantly, how she intended to protect it. Isolation does highly peculiar things to the human mind. When a community deliberately cuts you off, stripping away your social standing overnight, the sudden absence of noise is deafening. For the first few days following my banishment, the silence inside my Providence apartment felt like a physical punishment. I watched the dust motes drift across the sunlight filtering through my cheap blinds, feeling the crushing weight of my mother's engineered social exile pressing down on my chest. I was a pariah in my own hometown, boxed in by a fabricated narrative I could not fight. But prolonged solitude is a fascinating mechanism. Once the initial shock wears off, the quiet stops being a weapon used against you and transforms into a tactical advantage. Without the constant draining obligation of attending fake Sunday dinners or decoding my sister's passive-aggressive text messages, my schedule was entirely clear. My parents wanted to wage a war over the commercial legacy. They wanted to cast me out of the corporate fortress. I realized that if I planned to dismantle their siege, I required a comprehensive understanding of the bedrock that fortress was built upon. I needed to look past my father's inflated ego and investigate the original architect of our maritime empire. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I took a personal day from the hospital. I bypassed the clinical, modern corridors of my workplace and drove directly to the Rhode Island State Archives located in downtown Providence. The towering stone building smelled of aged parchment floor wax and bureaucratic permanence. It was a place where history was locked away in climate-controlled vaults, far removed from the flashy, champagne-soaked galas of Newport. I approached the reference desk and submitted a formal request for the original incorporation filings, corporate charters, and probate records associated with Ruiz Maritime dating back 3 decades. The archivist, a quiet man with silver wire-rimmed glasses, wheeled a heavy metal cart out from the back rooms. He placed 2 thick, dust-covered banker's boxes onto a long wooden reading table. I sat down under the harsh fluorescent lighting and began to work. I did not skim the pages. I deployed the exact same meticulous scrutiny I used to hunt down billing anomalies in dense medical databases. I traced the paper trail backward, peeling away the layers of polished public relations my parents had constructed to hide their own mediocrity. It took 4 hours of sifting through dense legal terminology to unearth the terrifying, beautiful secret buried at the very bottom of the second box. Hector did not build Ruiz Maritime from the ground up. He had spent my entire life loudly boasting about his visionary entrepreneurship, claiming he pulled the company out of the ocean with his bare hands. The documents proved that narrative was a thorough fabrication. The initial seed capital, the purchase orders for the first 3 commercial fishing trawlers, and the original waterfront property deeds were all executed by my late grandmother Rosa. She was the sole financial engine of the enterprise. When she passed away, she did not simply hand the keys to her son blindly. Rosa possessed a shrewd, calculating mind. She knew exactly what kind of man Hector was. She recognized his dangerous appetite for status, his reckless financial impulses, and his tendency to cut corners. To protect her life's work from his profound incompetence, she placed her equity into a highly specific ironclad testamentary trust. I unfolded the yellowed pages of the trust agreement, my index finger tracing the faded, typewritten ink. The stipulations were a masterpiece of defensive corporate architecture. The document dictated that the primary operational voting shares, representing a 51% controlling stake in the enterprise, did not pass automatically to Hector upon her death. Instead, Rosa established a conditional succession plan. The trust explicitly stated that whichever blood relative held the active master commercial maritime licenses for the fleet possessed the unassailable legal right to claim the majority stake. The shares were held in a dormant status, waiting for the designated license holder to file a formal grievance and execute the transfer with the state registry. Rosa wanted to guarantee that whoever legally operated the boats, whoever bore the actual responsibility for the vessels on the water, would always hold the power to outvote whoever merely sat in the executive office. She encoded her core philosophy into binding corporate law. The ocean only respects who knows how to navigate. I sat perfectly still in that quiet archive room. The ambient hum of the ventilation system seemed to fade away. A cold, electric shock of realization traveled down my spine. I closed my eyes and vividly recalled a rainy Sunday morning 5 years ago. I remembered the smell of stale cigar smoke in my father's study. I remembered him shoving a pen into my hand, desperate to dodge the insurance fallout from his concealed driving under the influence charge. He had viewed the licensing transfer as a meaningless administrative chore, a bureaucratic annoyance delegated to the invisible daughter because he despised paperwork. Hector thought Rosa's restrictive clause was buried, forgotten, and neutralized by the passage of time. He had zero comprehension of how the trust functioned, because he never bothered to read the foundational bylaws of his own mother's company. His hubris was so monumental that he assumed the empire belonged to him simply because he occupied the largest office. By forcing me to sign those registry documents 5 years ago to save his own skin, my father had inadvertently met the exact conditions of the trust. He had handed me the master keys to the kingdom. I did not just have leverage anymore. I held the legal right to seize control of the entire board of directors. I carefully photocopied every single page of the trust and the incorporation charters. I placed the warm sheets of paper into a crisp folder, paid the archiving fee, and walked out into the busy Providence streets. The autumn air tasted incredibly sweet in my lungs. My parents and my embezzling brother-in-law were currently popping champagne across the bay, celebrating their successful campaign to ruin my professional reputation, blissfully ignorant that they were standing directly on a triggered landmine. They thought they had successfully boxed me into a corner where I could never threaten their lifestyle. But possessing a weapon is vastly different from knowing how to detonate it properly. I was a healthcare data analyst, not a corporate raider. Navigating the hostile takeover of a lucrative hospitality network required a specific type of predator. If I filed the ownership claim incorrectly, Hector's expensive defense attorneys would bury me in endless injunctions until the legal fees bankrupted me. They would drag the proceedings through civil court for years, allowing Jason to continue draining the operational accounts until there was nothing left to salvage. I needed legal representation that specialized in corporate bloodshed. I required an attorney who understood how to execute a silent, lethal maneuver through the state registry before the current board even realized they were under attack. And I needed to secure that representation while keeping my face entirely blank. I had to maintain the illusion of the broken, defeated outcast. If Hector caught even a slight whisper that I was reviewing Rosa's trust, he would scramble to forge new licensing documents or liquidate the physical assets to protect his wealth. I had to smile through the continued isolation, playing the part of the tragic failure my mother had invented, while a terrifying countdown clock began to tick in the background. My search for the right lawyer was about to introduce an entirely new layer of danger to my plan. I did not confront them with this newfound knowledge. Marching into my father's study waving 30-year-old documents would only give him the opportunity to call his defense attorneys. I needed a professional executioner. 2 days after my visit to the state archives, I requested a personal day from the hospital administration. I drove an hour north on Interstate 95, leaving the insular borders of Rhode Island behind, and crossed into the towering concrete canyons of the Boston Financial District. I bypassed the flashy, localized lawyers who golfed with my father. I needed someone outside the Newport ecosystem. I needed Anthony Mercer. Mercer was a senior partner at a firm specializing in hostile corporate takeovers and bitter shareholder disputes. His office sat on the 42nd floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the harbor. He did not offer me coffee or engage in polite small talk. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit and possessed the cold, calculating demeanor of a man who measured his time in $1,000 increments. I sat in the leather chair opposite his sprawling desk and slid the photocopies of Grandmother Rosa's trust, the original incorporation charters, and my active state maritime licenses across the polished glass surface. He picked up the stack of papers. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound in that sterile room was the crisp turn of paper and the faint rhythmic ticking of his platinum wristwatch. I watched his eyes track across the faded typewritten paragraphs. I studied the subtle shifts in his expression. He did not frown. He did not sigh. Instead, a slow, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. Anthony Mercer laid the documents flat on his desk and folded his hands. Your father has been running a lucrative hospitality network that he technically lost control of the day you signed those licensing renewals, he said. His voice was smooth, carrying the undeniable weight of legal certainty. Rosa drafted a brilliant succession trap. By holding these active master licenses, you possess the unassailable right to claim 51% of the primary voting shares. If we file this formal grievance with the Rhode Island Registry today, you are the majority shareholder of Ruiz Maritime. A wave of profound relief washed over me. I finally had the structural leverage to stop the bleeding. Do it, I instructed him, my voice steady. File the claim. Fire Jason. Force Hector to refinance the commercial bridge loan. Mercer raised a single hand, stopping my momentum. Filing the claim is the easy part, Elena, he cautioned. The Rhode Island Corporate Registry moves at a notoriously sluggish pace. It will take roughly 3 to 4 weeks for the state clerks to process the transfer stamp the grievance and legally bind your majority status into the public record. He leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from amused to deadly serious. If Hector or his son-in-law catch even a faint whisper that we are initiating this transfer, they will retaliate before the ink dries. They possess current executive access to all the operational accounts. In the time it takes the state to process your new ownership, they could liquidate the physical fleet, transfer the liquid cash to offshore entities, or bury us in emergency probate injunctions that will freeze the company for a decade. We must operate in total secrecy. Your father and Jason cannot know they are being hunted until the trap has already snapped shut over their ankles. I sat back in the chair, feeling the chill of the air conditioning seep through my blazer. I understood the tactical requirement. To keep my family from moving their assets, I needed to provide them with a spectacular distraction. I needed to feed them a narrative so intoxicating that they would drop their guard entirely. I had to become the exact character my mother had spent the last 2 weeks inventing. I had to play the role of the broken, hysterical, defeated ghost. I left Boston feeling a dangerous mixture of adrenaline and cold clarity. I drove back to my modest Providence apartment, sat on my faded sofa, and stared at my phone. It was time to deploy a red herring. I practiced my breathing for several minutes, deliberately making my breaths short, ragged, and shallow. I thought about the sheer indignity of the past 4 years. I channeled every ounce of frustration regarding my trapped credit score, my stolen weekends, and the casual cruelty of my banishment. I let genuine tears pool in my eyes. Then, I pressed the call button on my mother's contact profile. Isabel answered on the 4th ring. Her tone was clipped, radiating a practiced maternal disappointment. "Elena," she sighed. "I hope you are calling to offer Jason the apology he deserves." I did not answer her directly. Instead, I let out a loud, pathetic sob. I forced my voice to crack, pitching it an octave higher than my normal speaking register. "Mom!" I choked out, wrapping my arms around my knees to physically compress my lungs. "I cannot do this anymore. The rumors at the hospital are ruining my life. Dr. Arrington demoted me. Everyone looks at me like I am crazy." The line went silent for a fraction of a second. I could practically hear the triumphant gears turning in her head. She had won. Her engineered social exile had worked flawlessly. "Oh, Elena," she murmured, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickening honeyed sweetness. "We tried to warn you. When you behave so erratically, people are going to notice. You brought this isolation upon yourself." I cried harder, leaning into the performance. "I know," I whimpered, letting a desperate, ragged edge bleed into the audio. "I was just so stressed about the bridge loan. I am sorry. I cannot take the whispering anymore. I am going to submit my resignation to the hospital administration tomorrow morning. I think I need to break my apartment lease and move out of state. I just want to disappear." My mother let out a soft, sympathetic cluck of her tongue. "Moving might be the healthiest choice for you right now, sweetheart," she said, offering her blessing to my permanent exit. "A fresh start in a new city, far away from the pressures of our family business, will give you the space to heal your mind. Your father and I will pray for your recovery. Just focus on packing your things. We will handle everything here in Newport." She hung up the phone. I lowered the device from my ear, wiped the manufactured tears from my cheeks, and let out a long, steady breath. The performance was flawless. Isabel would relay that entire conversation to Hector and Camila before dinner. They would pop an expensive bottle of champagne and celebrate my surrender. By convincing them I was fleeing the state in disgrace, I had successfully neutralized their paranoia. They would spend the next 3 weeks planning their grand victory lap entirely blind to the legal guillotine Anthony Mercer was currently hoisting directly above their heads. I spent the following days packing random cardboard boxes in my living room, maintaining the illusion just in case my sister sent someone to check on my progress. I went to my shifts at the hospital, keeping my head bowed, playing the role of the tragic outcast. Everything was aligning perfectly. The state registry was processing the trust claim. My parents were distracted by their own hubris. I thought I had accounted for every possible variable on the board, but I made one critical miscalculation. I underestimated the sheer desperation of a thief cornered by his own greed. Jason was not nearly as complacent as my father. While Hector and Isabel were busy planning their Newport coronation, Jason was quietly covering his tracks inside the corporate servers. He began auditing the digital footprint of the company network, searching for any lingering vulnerabilities that could expose his Cranston shell accounts. It was only a matter of time before he noticed the server logs I had exported on the night I discovered his embezzlement. The silence I had carefully constructed was about to shatter, forcing a confrontation far sooner than my lawyer or I had ever anticipated. Just as I thought the trap was perfectly set, A disaster nearly derailed the entire operation. I had constructed a flawless facade of a broken, defeated woman, packing her belongings in a dreary Providence apartment. I assumed the sheer arrogance of my parents would blind them to any underlying threats. I believed that by feeding Isabel the exact narrative she craved, I had bought Anthony Mercer the necessary 3 weeks to navigate the notoriously sluggish Rhode Island corporate registry. I envisioned a quiet, unhurried march toward victory. I was deeply mistaken. While my father and mother were busy celebrating their social triumph, I had severely underestimated the raw, vibrating paranoia of a cornered thief. Jason was a grifter, but he was not an idiot. Men who spend their entire adult lives pretending to possess generational wealth develop a highly tuned survival instinct. They know exactly how fragile their illusions are, and they are constantly scanning the perimeter for cracks. A week after I was banished from the family estate, Jason decided to secure his digital footprint. He contacted the outsourced information technology firm Heir used and requested a comprehensive audit of the Ruiz Maritime server access logs. He wanted to ensure that when my administrative privileges were revoked, every possible backdoor was sealed. The outsourced technician ran the diagnostic and handed Jason the final report. That document contained a time-stamped digital trail of every action performed on the network over the past 30 days. Jason sat in his plush corner office overlooking the marina, reading the lines of code, and felt his blood run cold. Right there, glaring back at him in stark black and white, was a massive data export. The log showed that at 3 a.m, on the exact day I confronted Heir, my user credentials had downloaded 50 pages of vendor payment histories, bank routing ledgers, and state registry filings. Jason realized in an instant that I did not just glance at the evidence of his embezzlement. I had taken the receipts with me. The realization that I held undeniable proof of his $200,000 theft must have triggered a suffocating panic. He knew my tearful phone call to Isabel was a diversion. He knew I was not fleeing the state in disgrace. I was arming myself for a siege. Panic often breeds a very specific, ruthless breed of creativity. Jason knew he could not simply confess to Heir. He needed to neutralize my evidence by destroying the source of it, and he needed to accomplish this before I pulled the trigger. So he spent a weekend fabricating a masterpiece of corporate deceit. He utilized his access to the internal email servers to draft a series of highly convincing doctored communications. He created spoofed emails that appeared to originate from my personal account, corresponding with a fictional real estate broker. The forged emails painted a devastating picture. They outlined a plan where I was allegedly funneling cash from the commercial bridge loan to secure a down payment on a luxury townhouse in Warwick. He used the exact address of the modest property I had actually tried to purchase months prior, twisting a painful reality into a malicious fiction. Furthermore, he drafted a fake legal memo suggesting I was coordinating with a predatory Providence law firm. According to Jason's fabricated narrative, I was preparing to sue Ruiz Maritime for emotional distress and financial mismanagement, intending to freeze the operational accounts and drain whatever capital remained in the company coffers. Armed with this pristine stack of forged documents, Jason drove to the Newport estate and demanded an emergency meeting with my father. He bypassed Isabel and walked straight into Heir's study, laying the fake emails onto the leather blotter with a look of grave manufactured concern. Jason spun a terrifying story. He told Heir that my mental breakdown was a calculated performance. He claimed I was a bitter, vindictive criminal, intent on destroying the family legacy because I was jealous of his marriage to Camilla. Heir swallowed the lie without a single moment of hesitation. It is a terrifying reality of human psychology that people will eagerly embrace a lie if it validates their pre-existing prejudices. Believing Jason's forged emails allowed Heir to maintain his illusion. It confirmed his deep-seated belief that I was a jealous, ungrateful daughter, and it preserved his fantasy that he had chosen the perfect son-in-law. My father did not pause to verify the digital signatures on the emails. He did not hire an independent auditor. He simply saw a threat to his remaining wealth and reacted with blind, sweeping urgency. Hector decided he could not wait for a gradual, graceful transition of power. If he believed I was preparing a hostile lawsuit to freeze the corporate assets he needed to build an impenetrable legal firewall immediately, he needed to transfer the remaining executive powers, the operational voting proxies, and the physical asset deeds to Camilla and Jason to protect the empire from my supposed extortion. I discovered this catastrophic shift in the timeline through a single overlooked digital breadcrumb. When Hector revoked my access to the Ruiz Maritime corporate servers, he forgot about our shared family cloud calendar. It was an old, mundane digital schedule Isabel had set up years ago to track holidays, yacht club galas, and dentist appointments. Nobody had bothered to remove my profile from the sharing permissions. I was sitting in my living room drinking a lukewarm cup of coffee and waiting for a status update from Anthony Mercer when my phone screen illuminated. A new calendar event had been added by Hector's administrative assistant, syncing directly to my device. The event was scheduled for Thanksgiving evening, right in the middle of the opulent gala my parents were hosting. The title of the appointment made the air in my lungs evaporate. It read, "Corporate Succession Transfer and Legal Execution. Notary Public confirmed for 8 p.m. The phone nearly slipped from my trembling fingers. The Thanksgiving gathering was no longer just a boastful social announcement. Hector had hired a notary to attend the party. He was planning to sign the binding executive transfer documents in front of 50 wealthy witnesses, turning a ceremonial toast into a legally enforceable corporate handover. I immediately called Mercer. He answered on the second ring, the ambient noise of downtown Boston echoing in the background. I read the calendar notification to him, my voice tight with escalating panic. I asked him what would happen if Hector signed those transfer deeds before our trust claim cleared the Rhode Island registry. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and grim. When Mercer finally spoke, his tone lacked its usual confident edge. If your father legally transfers the executive proxies and the operational accounts to Jason, it creates a catastrophic bottleneck, Mercer explained. Even though you possess the rightful claim to the 51% majority through Rose's trust, Jason will have the immediate legal authority to drain the liquid cash and move it into offshore shell companies before the state processes your ownership. We would have to fight them in civil probate court to untangle the forged transfers. How long would that take? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Years, Mercer replied flatly. It would tie the company up in litigation for a decade. And during that time, the commercial bridge loan tied to your name will undoubtedly default. Your credit will be annihilated, and the banks will seize whatever physical assets remain. We are caught in a race against state bureaucracy, Elena. A profound, suffocating pressure descended upon my shoulders. The trap I had so carefully constructed was suddenly closing in on me. I had a ticking clock, and the countdown was moving with terrifying speed. There were only 2 weeks left until Thanksgiving. 2 weeks until Jason acquired the legal immunity to destroy my financial future permanently. I could not hide in my apartment anymore. I could not wait passively for the slow wheels of the government to turn. I had to walk directly into the lion's den. I had to attend that Newport gala, stand in a room filled with people who despised me, and hope that Anthony Mercer could force the state clerks to stamp my paperwork before the notary public raised their pen. The holiday was no longer a simple family gathering. It was the deadline for my survival. Thanksgiving in Newport is rarely an exercise in gratitude. For the demographic my parents courted the holiday is simply another stage designed for the display of accumulated wealth. The wind blowing off Narragansett Bay carried a bitter, stinging chill, but the sprawling driveway of my parents' estate radiated heat from the idling engines of imported luxury sedans. Valets in crisp black vests sprinted across the crushed white shells, opening heavy doors for local politicians, hospital board directors, and coastal real estate developers. The sprawling front lawn was illuminated by temporary theatrical lighting, casting long, dramatic shadows against the historic brick facade of the mansion. This was not a holiday dinner meant for quiet reflection. It was a coronation, masquerading as a feast. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my worn wool coat. I pulled the device out and read a single sterile line of text from Isabel. "Come support your sister today, Elena, and do not make a scene." The message lacked any trace of maternal warmth or genuine concern for my fabricated mental health crisis. She merely issued a cold directive. She wanted the defeated ghost present in the room to serve as a stark visual contrast to Camila's impending triumph. My mother needed the audience to see my dull, lifeless compliance, to validate the narrative she had spun across the country club circuit. I sat in my 10-year-old sedan parked 2 blocks down the winding coastal road, watching the line of cars snake through the wrought iron gates. My hands gripped the cracked leather of my steering wheel so tightly my knuckles throbbed with a dull ache. The digital clock on the dashboard flipped to 6:45 in the evening. The hired notary public was scheduled to arrive in 15 minutes. My chest felt entirely hollow, caught in the terrifying, breathless limbo between anticipation and total financial ruin. If Anthony Mercer failed to push the paperwork through the bureaucratic maze of the state capitol, the evening would end with Hector permanently signing away my future. Then the screen of my phone illuminated with a new encrypted message. The sender was Anthony Mercer. I opened the thread, my pulse hammering fiercely against my ribs. The text contained only 2 sentences, but they carried the weight of a tectonic shift. The state registry just cleared the trust claim. You are officially on record as the 51% owner of Ruiz Maritime. A profound, grounding warmth spread through my veins, chasing away the autumn chill. The ticking clock that had been suffocating me for 2 relentless weeks vanished into the ether. The desperate race against the government bureaucracy was over. I had won. I locked my phone screen, stepped out of the cold cabin of my vehicle, and walked toward the glowing golden windows of the estate. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors, stepping into a foyer that buzzed with the low, rhythmic hum of old money. Waiters in pristine white coats balanced silver trays of raw oysters and expensive champagne, weaving seamlessly through the crowded parlors. I wore a plain off-the-rack navy dress I had purchased 3 years ago for a hospital seminar. Next to the tailored silk gowns, the draped cashmere, and the bespoke velvet blazers of the invited attendees, I looked exactly like the broken failure they all believed me to be. Aunt Vivian intercepted me near the mahogany coat check counter. She placed a heavily ringed hand on my shoulder, her manicured nails digging slightly into my collarbone. She offered a look of profound, sickening pity, her brow furrowing with rehearsed sympathy. "We are all praying for your recovery, dear," she murmured, keeping her voice deliberately low so the nearby yacht club commodore would not overhear the scandal. "Just take a deep breath tonight and try to be happy for your sister. She deserves this moment." I offered a tight, compliant smile, thanking Vivian for her concern. The sheer condescension dripping from her words would have crushed my spirit a month ago. It would have set me retreating to the nearest corner in tears. Tonight, armed with the digital confirmation from Mercer, the pity felt like high comedy. I excused myself from her grip and moved toward the periphery of the grand living room, finding a quiet shadow near the towering stone fireplace. That is when Jason spotted me. He detached himself from a circle of local angel investors and sauntered across the Persian rug. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his frame flawlessly. His blonde hair swept back with calculated, arrogant precision. He held 2 heavy crystal tumblers of amber bourbon. He extended one of the glasses toward me, his mouth curving into a smug, untouchable smirk. Jason genuinely believed he was an apex predator who had successfully cornered his prey. He thought his forged emails had permanently eliminated my threat to his embezzlement scheme. "Drink up, Elena," he said, his tone laced with a mocking, patronizing gentleness. "It is a night for celebrating fresh starts. We all want you to find your peace, away from the stress of the maritime business. I know the corporate world was just too heavy for you to carry." I took the heavy crystal tumbler from his outstretched hand. The liquid sloshed against the glass, catching the light of the chandelier. I looked directly into his eyes, searching for any microscopic hint of guilt regarding the $200,000 he stole from my family. There was none. His gaze was entirely hollow, fueled only by greed and self-preservation. "Thank you, Jason," I replied, keeping my voice smooth and eerily even. "I think tonight is going to change everything for all of us." He chuckled softly, oblivious to the lethal double meaning hidden inside my words, and walked back across the room to join Camilla. I leaned against the cool stone of the mantel and watched the theater unfold before me. The dramatic irony hanging in the suffocating air was so thick, I could practically taste it on my tongue. Hector stood near the center of the parlor, puffing out his chest, while a powerful state senator praised the upcoming succession plan. My father gestured broadly with his hands, playing the role of the benevolent, wise patriarch, passing the torch to the next generation of maritime leaders. He was actively basking in the admiration of his wealthy peers, inflating his fragile ego to the utmost breaking point. He introduced Camilla to the local politicians, framing her as the brilliant logistical mind that saved the company from ruin. Through the crowd, I noticed a woman in a gray business suit arrive through the side entrance, carrying a thick leather briefcase. The notary public had arrived. Hector caught her eye across the crowded room and offered a discreet, triumphant nod. He thought he was about to sign away a multi-million-dollar empire to protect it from my imaginary grasp. He believed the stroke of his expensive fountain pen would finalize my exile and secure his legacy for decades to come. He had no idea that the sprawling hospitality network he was parading around no longer belonged to him. He did not know that the state registry had already stripped him of his executive power before the first guest even arrived. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the sharp burn settle in the back of my throat. I watched Camilla laugh at a joke I could not hear, her hand resting possessively on Jason's tailored arm. They were constructing a magnificent towering castle out of thin air, entirely unaware that I held the unbreakable deed to the land beneath it. The caterers began clearing the hors d'oeuvre plates, signaling the transition to the main event. The ambient chatter began to lower in volume as the guests anticipated a speech. Hector moved purposefully toward the grand staircase, picking up a silver spoon from a nearby dessert tray. I set my glass down on a side table, feeling the adrenaline begin to spike sharply in my bloodstream. The elaborate charade was rapidly reaching its zenith. The trap I had meticulously built in the shadows was finally ready to spring under the brightest lights in Newport. He was about to ask for everyone's undivided attention, and I was preparing to give him exactly what he wanted. The elaborate catered feast finally reached its conclusion. Uniformed servers moved silently through the grand dining room, swiftly clearing away bone china plates smeared with the remnants of roasted turkey, cranberry compote, and rich sage stuffing. The air grew heavy, thick, with the mingling aromas of freshly brewed espresso, dark chocolate truffles, and the expensive floral perfumes worn by the socialites. A warm golden light spilled from the massive crystal chandeliers above, illuminating a sea of flushed, satisfied faces. The ambient noise was a steady hum of privileged conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of polite laughter. It was the sound of a community entirely at ease with its own excess. I remained anchored to my chair near the kitchen doors, a silent observer, swallowed by the shadows. I watched my father rise from his seat at the head of the impossibly long mahogany table. Hector Ruiz moved with the calculated grace of a seasoned politician preparing to deliver a keynote address. He reached for a silver spoon and tapped it gently against the rim of his champagne flute. The sharp, clear chime sliced through the ambient chatter. The room responded instantly. The laughter faded into a respectful, expectant hush. 50 influential guests shifted in their seats, turning their collective attention toward the patriarch. The hired photographer shuffled quietly along the perimeter, raising a heavy camera lens to capture the impending historical moment. Hector smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo and offered a broad, benevolent smile to his captive audience. He allowed the silence to stretch for a few deliberate seconds, maximizing the theatrical tension. Family is the anchor of our lives. Hector began, his baritone voice projecting effortlessly across the vast dining room. His tone was dripping with rehearsed, manufactured emotion. It is the whole that keeps us afloat when the waters grow turbulent. For decades, Isabel and I have dedicated our blood, our sweat, and our sleepless nights to building Ruiz Maritime into a crown jewel of the Rhode Island coast. We have weathered brutal economic storms, navigated shifting tides, and maintained the strict standard of excellence that our community demands. He paused, taking a slow sip from his crystal glass, letting the weight of his legacy settle over the wealthy attendees. The irony of his words was physically nauseating. He spoke of weathering storms, deliberately omitting the fact that he was the one who steered the company into a catastrophic financial hurricane. He spoke of blood and sweat, conveniently erasing the 4 years I spent chained to a predatory commercial loan to save his sinking ship. But a legacy cannot simply be inherited. Hector continued, his voice growing louder, commanding the space. A true legacy must be earned. It must be passed to those who have demonstrated unwavering loyalty, who have rolled up their sleeves and stood by this company through thick and thin. It belongs to those who possess the vision to carry our name into the next century. During this entire monologue, my father did not cast a single glance in my direction. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the glowing faces surrounding him, purposefully editing me out of the narrative. I was a stain he was vigorously scrubbing from the family portrait. Tonight, Hector declared, placing a hand on his chest, Isabel and I are proud to officially announce that we are stepping back from the daily operations of the empire we built. We are passing the torch. Effective immediately, I am transferring my remaining executive powers and the full operational control of Ruiz Maritime to the next generation. He turned to his right, extending an open palm toward my sister and her husband. Camila and Jason, he announced, his voice booming with patriarchal pride. You are the sole heirs to our maritime legacy. I proudly present the new managing partners of Ruiz Maritime. The dining room erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. Chair legs scraped against the marble floor as local politicians and hospital executives leaped to their feet, eager to applaud the newly minted royalty. Isabel buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept, theatrically, perfectly calibrated tears of joy. She reached out and grasped my father's arm, playing the role of the overwhelmed, loving matriarch to absolute perfection. Camila stood up, her silk gown rustling, and pressed a delicate kiss against Jason's cheek. She feigned a look of profound, humble surprise, despite having rehearsed this exact moment in front of her vanity mirror for the past 2 weeks. Jason wrapped a possessive arm around her waist, flashing a brilliant, predatory smile at the applauding crowd. He looked exactly like a man who had successfully pulled off the heist of the century. He raised his glass high in the air, accepting the admiration of his peers. I watched Dr. Arrington, my direct supervisor from the hospital, clapping enthusiastically near the front of the room. He was the man who had demoted me just days prior, citing my supposed mental instability. Seeing him applaud the very people who had orchestrated my professional ruin ignited a cold, focused fury deep within my chest. My parents had successfully weaponized my entire community against me. They had convinced these educated, influential people that I was a broken, bitter outcast. Jason leaned in and whispered something into Camila's ear. She let out a musical bell-like laugh, her eyes sparkling under the chandelier light. He raised his glass specifically toward the corner of the room where I sat, offering a microscopic mocking tilt of his chin. He wanted to ensure I witnessed my own execution. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of his triumph. They toasted to their brilliant future. They celebrated their absolute, total victory. They had done it. They had publicly erased me from the family lineage, securing their wealth and neutralizing my threat in front of 50 powerful witnesses. The dramatic irony vibrating through the room was so potent, it made my skin prickle. I sat in the back, entirely unnoticed, watching a man give away a sprawling hospitality network that he no longer owned. Hector was attempting to bestow a kingdom he had already lost. He was handing Jason the keys to a hollowed-out shell, completely blind to the fact that the state registry had already stripped him of his crown hours ago. Through the cheering crowd, I saw the woman in the gray business suit step forward. The notary public unclasped her heavy leather briefcase and laid a thick stack of legal documents onto the mahogany table directly in front of my father. She produced a gold fountain pen, uncapped it, and extended it toward Hector. These were the executive transfer deeds. These were the papers designed to permanently lock me out of the corporate structure and grant Jason the legal immunity he needed to drain the remaining capital. The woman in the gray suit carefully arranged the signature pages. She flattened the creases of the heavy legal stock, pointing a manicured finger at the designated dotted lines. Hector reached for the pen. His fingers brushed the cool metal barrel. The applause began to simmer down as the guests leaned in, eager to witness the physical signing of the contract. The grand culmination of their social climbing was mere seconds away from becoming legally binding. If he inked his signature onto those pages, the ensuing legal battle would drag through probate court for a decade, giving Jason ample time to liquidate the fleet and destroy my credit score forever. I realized I could not simply wait for the party to end. I could not allow that ink to touch the paper. The elaborate charade had reached its absolute limit. It was time to retrieve the weapon Anthony Mercer had brought me. It was time to pull the pin on the grenade and roll it directly down the center of that opulent dining table. I stood up from my chair. I did not make a sound. I slipped through the heavy French doors, leaving the warmth of the cheering crowd behind, and stepped out into the freezing coastal wind to fetch the heavy red folder that would end their reign forever. I did not cry. I did not scream or flip a table or throw a glass against the wall like a petulant child. When you spend your entire life being treated as an unstable liability, you learn very quickly that displaying raw emotion only hands your abusers the exact ammunition they desire. I simply reached down and picked up my pristine cloth napkin. I folded the white linen carefully, smoothing out the creases with my thumbs, and set it gently on the back of my dining chair. The scrape of the wooden legs moving against the marble floor was completely swallowed by the thunderous applause echoing through the grand parlor. I turned my back on the smiling politicians, the weeping mother, and the triumphant sister. I slipped through the heavy French doors, leaving the stifling perfume-laced heat of the dining room behind. The transition was a violent physical shock. The crisp, salty air of the Atlantic Ocean whipped across my face the moment I stepped outside onto the sprawling veranda. The freezing November wind stung my cheeks, but it successfully cleared the suffocating fog of expensive cigars and roasted turkey from my lungs. I walked down the sweeping cobblestone driveway, leaving the glowing windows of the historic Newport mansion in my wake. The manicured hedges lining the path cast long, jagged shadows across the crushed white shells, illuminated only by the soft flicker of the antique gas lanterns my mother had imported from Europe. My sensible, cheap heels clicked against the stones, a steady, rhythmic march that echoed loudly in the quiet coastal darkness. At the very end of the property, parked just beyond the towering wrought iron security gates, sat Anthony Mercer. His sleek black sedan was idling, the engine humming with a low, predatory vibration that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. The headlights were cut, rendering the vehicle nearly invisible against the dense tree line. As I approached the heavy iron gates, the driver's side door swung open. Mercer stepped out onto the gravel shoulder. He wore a heavy wool overcoat tailored sharply at the shoulders, his breath pluming in the freezing Rhode Island air. He did not offer a warm, comforting greeting. He did not ask how the lavish holiday feast tasted or how my family was enjoying their opulent gala. Mercer operated entirely outside the sycophantic Newport bubble. He was a Boston corporate litigator who functioned purely on actionable intelligence and ruthless strategy. He reached into the passenger seat of his vehicle and retrieved a thick, heavy red folder. He took 2 steps forward and held the vibrant red cardstock out to me. Our fingers brushed briefly as I took possession of it. The physical weight of the folder in my hands felt profound, heavy enough to alter the gravitational pull of my entire world. Inside that crimson binding lay the state-stamped trust transfers executed just hours prior. It held the official maritime license verifications, bearing the raised gold seal of the Rhode Island government. Tucked behind those state documents was the finalized forensic accounting audit, complete with bank routing numbers and shell company registrations, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that Jason had embezzled $200,000. This was not just a collection of bureaucratic paperwork. It was a loaded weapon, manufactured entirely out of paper and ink. It was the culmination of months of silence, isolation, and meticulous calculation. Mercer gave me a single curt nod, silently acknowledging that our bureaucratic siege had been successful. He stepped back into the warmth of his car, pulled the door shut, and shifted the sedan into gear, leaving me standing alone in the freezing dark. I stood there for a long, quiet moment, gripping the folder with both hands. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. I felt a fundamental, permanent shift occur within the very marrow of my bones. For 31 years, I had allowed myself to be the invisible workhorse. I had accepted the role of the silent ghost haunting the hallways of my parents' ambition. I had let them trap my credit score, steal my weekends, and claim my professional achievements as their own. But holding that folder, feeling the cold, embossed texture of the cover against my palms, I realized the ghost was officially dead. The woman standing in the driveway was no longer a terrified, demoted healthcare data analyst begging for her father's approval. She was the 51% majority shareholder of a multi-million-dollar maritime empire. I opened my eyes. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back against the biting wind. The fear that had lived in my chest for 4 long years completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. I turned on my heel and began the march back up the cobblestone path. The gravel crunched loudly under the soles of my shoes, announcing my return to the fortress. I grasped the cold brass handles of the heavy front doors and pushed them open. The noise of the party washed over me once again, but this time it did not feel intimidating. It sounded incredibly hollow. I walked directly into the grand dining room. The scene had progressed exactly as I anticipated. The woman in the gray business suit, the hired notary public, was currently pointing a manicured fingernail at the bottom of the executive transfer deed. Hector had the gold fountain pen grasped firmly in his right hand, the nib hovering mere millimeters above the dotted line. I did not stop at the back of the room. I did not shrink into the shadows near the catering kitchen. I marched straight through the dense crowd of elite guests. I walked past Dr. Arrington, ignoring his bewildered, wide-eyed stare. I walked past Aunt Vivian, brushing past her draped cashmere shawl. The wealthy attendees naturally parted from me, sensing the sudden dangerous shift in the atmospheric pressure. I moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, until I stood directly at the head of the long mahogany table. I positioned myself right between my father and my sister. I raised my arm and dropped the heavy red folder onto the polished wood, landing it directly on top of the blank executive transfer deeds Hector was preparing to sign. The heavy, authoritative thud echoed like a gunshot in a cathedral. The sound sliced through the ambient chatter, silencing the massive room instantly. The polite laughter died in the throats of the local politicians. The servers carrying dessert trays froze perfectly in their tracks. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto the bright red folder sitting like a bleeding wound on the pristine white linen tablecloth. Hector slowly lowered his gold fountain pen. The triumphant patriarchal flush drained entirely from his face, replaced immediately by a deep, defensive glare. He looked at the folder, then slowly raised his head to look up at me. The muscles in his jaw clenched with a sudden, humiliating fury. He hated being interrupted, but he despised being interrupted in front of his wealthy peers even more. "Elena, what is this?" Hector demanded. His voice dropped into a dangerous, gravelly register, vibrating with the threat of severe punishment. "We are celebrating." "Before you celebrate," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room, "you should probably read who actually owns the controlling shares of the company you just gave away." The words hung in the stifling air, suspended above the crystal champagne flutes and the half-eaten desserts. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The local politicians, the hospital board executives, and the coastal real estate developers remained frozen in their seats. The collective breath of 50 influential guests caught in their throats. The ambient hum of privileged conversation had vanished, replaced by a dense, suffocating quiet. Somewhere in the back of the parlor, a silver spoon slipped from a saucer and clattered sharply against the marble floor. Hector stared at the heavy red folder resting on the pristine white linen tablecloth. His initial reaction was a patronizing scoff, a brief, breathy sound meant to dismiss me as a trivial nuisance. He looked around the room, offering a tight, forced smile to his wealthy peers, silently asking for their patience while he handled his unruly daughter. He reached out to brush the folder aside, intending to resume his grand patriarchal speech, but his fingers brushed the thick cardstock, and a strange hesitation overtook him. He flipped open the crimson cover. The first page resting inside was the certified legal declaration drafted by Anthony Mercer. The document bore the raised gold seal of the Rhode Island State Registry, a physical emblem of undeniable governmental authority. Hector picked up the sheet of paper. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal typography. I watched the arrogant, triumphant flush drain from his cheeks, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened. The crisp linen of his tailored tuxedo shirt suddenly seemed to suffocate him. The papers trembled in his grip, producing a faint rhythmic rustling sound that echoed through the dead silence of the dining room. "That is a lie," Hector choked out. His baritone voice had lost all its resonance, reduced to a hollow, reedy whisper. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and profound confusion. Rosa would not do this. She would never write such a clause. Grandma Rosa left 51% of this company to the license holder. I interrupted, ensuring my tone remained smooth, even and entirely devoid of emotion. I raised my arm and pointed toward the far wall of the dining room. Hanging proudly above the ornate antique credenza was a framed master commercial maritime license. It was a vanity piece. Hector had mounted it in a thick mahogany frame under museum-quality glass years ago. He used it as a prop to impress visiting yacht club commodores pointing to the official state seal to prove the legitimacy of his sprawling maritime empire. He had walked past that frame every single day for half a decade, treating it as a symbol of his unchallenged domain. Read the signature at the bottom. "Dad," I commanded my voice, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I do not need to walk over there to tell you what it says. It has been my name for 5 years. You forced me to sign those registry documents to save your own skin when you caught that driving charge. You handed me the keys because you were too arrogant to read the foundational bylaws of your own mother's trust. I executed the claim this morning. The state has already processed the transfer. You do not own this company. I do." The revelation washed over the crowd like a tidal wave of ice water. The social dynamics of the room inverted in real time. Aunt Vivian lowered her glass, her jaw dropping in unfiltered shock. Dr. Arrington, the man who had demoted me based on a fabricated mental health crisis, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze darting rapidly between my face and the state documents trembling in my father's hands. The wealthy attendees were beginning to realize they had been invited to a coronation, only to become witnesses to a hostile corporate execution. Isabel let out a sharp, genuine gasp. The theatrical, performative tears she had been weeping just moments prior evaporated instantly. She clutched the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning bone white, her carefully constructed illusion of maternal grace shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked at Hector, waiting for him to unleash a legal rebuttal, waiting for him to wave away my claims as the paranoid delusions of a sick woman. But Hector remained mute, staring at the raised gold seal, entirely paralyzed by his own monumental hubris. "This is fake!" Camilla shrieked. My sister lunged forward, her silk gown catching on the edge of her chair. She reached across the mahogany table, her manicured fingers clawing desperately at the red folder. She knocked over a crystal water goblet, sending a pool of ice and liquid spilling across the white linen. "She is crazy!" Camilla yelled, turning toward the audience with wild, panicked eyes. "You all know she is unstable. She mocked up these papers to ruin my night. Jason, tell them she is lying. Tell them this is a desperate extortion attempt." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground, an immovable object anchored to the floor, watching my sister unravel. Her loud, histrionic outburst provided the perfect contrast to my cold, surgical calm. The guests were no longer looking at me with condescending pity. They were looking at Camilla with deep, creeping suspicion. They were old money. They recognized the stark difference between a desperate lie and undeniable, documented leverage. I reached into the folder, bypassing my screaming sister, and extracted the second stack of papers. This bundle was much thicker, bound by a heavy black binder clip. It contained the finalized forensic accounting audit, the bank transfer logs, and the corporate registration details for the dummy logistics firm. I looked directly past Camilla and locked eyes with Jason. His smug, untouchable smirk had vanished the moment the folder hit the table. He stood frozen next to his frantic wife. His broad shoulders slumped, a thin sheen of nervous sweat breaking out across his forehead. He knew exactly what was inside the second stack. He recognized the formatting of the general ledger. I slid the heavy audit across the polished wood, pushing it right until it rested against the base of his champagne flute. "And before you step up as the new managing partner, Jason," I said, raising my volume just enough to ensure every single politician and investor in the room caught every syllable, "you should probably explain to this crowd why you have funneled $200,000 of company money into a Cranston shell account over the last 2 years." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the dining room. Accusing a prominent family member of a hostile takeover was scandalous, but accusing a supposed aristocratic gentleman of crude, systematic embezzlement was a social earthquake. I pointed to the top page of the audit, keeping my gaze pinned to his terrified eyes. I detailed the inflated marine fuel invoices. I continued my voice acting as a relentless metronome of accountability. I tracked the routing numbers directly to the post office box registered by your personal estate attorney. While you were standing in this very room, drinking my father's expensive bourbon and helping my mother spread rumors about my mental health, you were actively bleeding Ruiz Maritime dry. You are the reason the commercial bridge loan is facing default. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords seized. He looked down at the financial logs, the undeniable proof of his guilt, exposed under the bright chandelier lights. The entire room waited for his defense. They waited for the charming, quick-witted, aristocratic heir to laugh off the accusations and provide a reasonable explanation for the missing capital. Instead, Jason took a slow, trembling step backward, putting physical distance between himself and the printed evidence. The silence that followed was the loudest confession anyone could have ever offered. Jason froze as if his blood had suddenly turned to liquid nitrogen. The devastating, undeniable truth, laid bare on the mahogany table, dismantled the carefully constructed facade of the historic Newport gentleman in less than 3 seconds. The tailored tuxedo he wore suddenly seemed to hang loosely on his frame, his aristocratic posture collapsing under the crushing weight of exposure. His smugness, the very armor he had weaponized against me for the past 6 months, evaporated into a cold, visible sweat. He looked down at the bank routing logs detailing his Cranston Shell Company, and he realized he was trapped. There was no charming excuse he could deploy. There was no clever pivot he could execute to wriggle out of the snare. He had been caught, completely and publicly. The collective audible gasp from the 50 affluent members of Newport society echoed loudly against the vaulted ceiling. The local politicians who had just been praising Hector's visionary leadership now exchanged deeply uncomfortable, guarded glances. The hospital board directors, the very people my mother had manipulated with tales of my fabricated mental health crisis, were staring at Jason with a mixture of profound shock and rising disgust. This was the absolute genius of the strategy Anthony Mercer and I had developed. If I had simply marched into my father's study and confronted him in private, Hector would have undoubtedly attempted to sweep the entire disaster under the rug. He would have paid Jason off quietly, covered up the missing $200,000, and continued to gaslight me to protect the fragile illusion of his dynasty. But by detonating this explosive revelation in the center of the grand dining room, in front of the most influential peers in his social ecosystem, I had eliminated any possibility of a silent cover-up. The scandal was now public domain, and in the vicious, gossipy circles of Rhode Island wealth, Reputation is the only currency that truly matters. Hector gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles bone white. He leaned forward, his voice a low, desperate hiss meant only for my ears. "Elena," he pleaded, his tone completely stripped of its former patriarchal authority. "You cannot do this here. We can handle this privately. Keep this in the family, for God's sake." I looked down at the man who had ordered me out of his home just a few weeks prior. I felt absolutely no sympathy for his sudden desperation. "I am keeping it in the family," I replied, my voice smooth, steady, and projecting clearly enough for the front row of guests to hear every syllable. "I am the family, Dad. And I am cleaning house." I shifted my focus away from my father and locked eyes directly with Jason. The man who had spent the last 2 years treating me like a glorified administrative assistant was now trembling slightly. I did not raise my volume. I deployed the cold, mechanical precision of a seasoned executive finalizing a hostile corporate restructuring. "I am officially calling an emergency shareholder meeting for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," I announced, ensuring my words sliced through the lingering silence. As the 51% majority shareholder, my single vote is the only one that carries any legal authority. We do not need a quorum to execute this decision. Jason, your position as Director of Vendor Relations is terminated immediately. Camila let out a sharp, ragged sob, clutching the silk fabric of her gown. She reached for Jason's arm, but he flinched away, staring at the forensic audit as if it were a live grenade. "If you set foot on any marina property, or if you attempt to access the corporate servers remotely," I continued my gaze, boring relentlessly into Jason's terrified eyes, "I will personally hand this entire financial audit, including the spoofed emails you sent Hector, directly to the Rhode Island District Attorney's Office. You are leaving this house tonight, and you are never returning to my company." Jason opened his mouth, a weak, sputtering sound escaping his lips, but he could not formulate a coherent defense. The raw data sitting on the table had completely neutralized him. He took another step backward, retreating from the undeniable evidence of his own greed. I turned my attention to my older sister. Camilla was staring at me in absolute, unadulterated horror. The woman who had spent her entire adolescence mocking my quiet diligence, the woman who had happily claimed credit for my grueling weekend accounting sessions, was now confronting the terrifying reality that she possessed no actual power. "Furthermore," I said, addressing Camilla directly, "as the new majority owner of Ruiz Maritime, I am initiating an immediate asset recovery protocol. I am seizing the Porsche Panamera currently parked in the driveway. It is a company-leased vehicle, and I am liquidating it as a corporate asset to help offset the $200,000 your husband systematically stole from the operational accounts. The keys are going back to the dealership tomorrow morning. You will have to find your own transportation back to your carriage house." Camila's jaw dropped. The sheer humiliation of losing her primary status symbol in front of her wealthy peers broke whatever remained of her composure. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her husband's betrayal and her own impending financial ruin crashed down upon her. Finally, I turned back to Hector and Isabel. My parents looked small, entirely deflated standing at the head of the table they used to command. The lavish coronation they had spent weeks planning had been transformed into a public execution of their empire. "Tomorrow morning at exactly 10 o'clock, you will meet me at the commercial bank in downtown Providence," I instructed them, my voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "You are going to sign the paperwork to refinance the bridge loan, and you are going to remove my name from the liability immediately." Hector swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "And if we cannot secure the refinancing," he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "If you fail to secure the new loan terms," I replied, picking up the heavy red folder from the table, "I will utilize my executive authority to unilaterally liquidate the physical charter fleet. I will sell the yachts at auction to pay off the debt myself. The choice is yours, Dad. But make no mistake, you have zero operational control over this company as of tonight." I did not wait for a response. I did not need to witness their frantic whispered arguments or their desperate attempts to salvage their dignity in front of the stunned guests. I had delivered the corporate checkmate. I tucked the red folder securely under my arm, turned away from the devastated remains of the Ruiz family hierarchy, and walked back down the center aisle of the grand dining room. The wealthy attendees parted from me once again this time, with a mixture of deep respect and genuine fear. I walked out through the heavy double doors, leaving the warmth and the chaos of the Newport mansion behind. I stepped into the cold, crisp November night, feeling lighter than I had in 4 agonizing years. I walked down the driveway toward my 10-year-old sedan, the keys jingling softly in my pocket. The battle was officially over. But the true work, the reconstruction of my life, and the salvage of my grandmother's legacy was only just beginning. It has been 6 months since that Thanksgiving dinner. The guests did not stick around for dessert or coffee. They gathered their coats from the mahogany check counter in awkward, hushed silence and practically sprinted for the front doors. They were desperate to reach the privacy of their imported luxury sedans so they could immediately begin texting the scandalous details to the rest of Rhode Island high society. Within 48 hours, the news of Jason and his Cranston Shell Company had saturated every single country club, hospital boardroom, and charity luncheon in Newport. The social consequences for my parents were swift, brutal, and absolute. The high society invitations that had once flooded their mailbox dried up overnight. People like Dr. Arrington and Aunt Vivian did not offer them sympathy or support. The elite circles of Newport luxury recognized that Hector and Isabel had been conned by a faux aristocrat, and that realization rendered them socially toxic. They were no longer viewed as powerful coastal patriarchs. They were seen as desperate social climbers who had nearly bankrupted their own legacy because they were too blinded by pedigree to audit their own son-in-law. My parents still reside in that sprawling oceanfront mansion, but the grand parlors are silent now. The world they built with borrowed money and borrowed trust has contracted significantly, reducing their sprawling empire to the size of a kitchen table designed for 2. I followed through on every single threat I made in that dining room. On Friday morning at exactly 10 o'clock, Hector and Isabel met me at the commercial bank in downtown Providence. They sat across the polished desk from the loan officer, looking completely defeated, and signed the extensive legal paperwork required to refinance the massive bridge loan under their own names. The banker formally removed my signature from the liability documents. I walked out of that financial institution and checked my credit monitoring application on my phone. The score that had been artificially suppressed for 4 agonizing years immediately began a steady, unhindered climb upward. My financial future was finally my own again. I did not let Ruiz Maritime collapse. I utilized my authority as the 51% majority shareholder to hire a ruthless, highly competent management firm from Boston to handle the daily operations of the charter fleet. I fired Jason, formally severing his access to every corporate account and changing the locks on the marina offices. Without his constant systematic skimming, inflating our operational expenses, the company experienced a rapid financial stabilization. Within 3 months, our profit margins surged upward by a staggering 20%. The business is currently thriving, operating exactly as Grandmother Rosa intended it to. Camilla experienced the most severe whiplash of anyone in the family. The realization that her perfect marriage was funded by corporate theft completely shattered her carefully curated reality. She filed for divorce from Jason in January, a messy, highly publicized legal separation that further damaged her social standing. I seized the keys to her company-leased Porsche Panamera and returned the vehicle to the dealership utilizing the recovered funds to partially offset the $200,000 her husband had stolen. Camilla left with a disgraced, broke husband and absolutely zero equity in the family business, was forced to confront the harsh reality of earning a living. She eventually secured an entry-level administrative position at a boutique real estate agency in Narragansett. She spends 40 hours a week managing spreadsheets, filing client paperwork, and handling back-end data entry. She is now performing the exact kind of tedious, unglamorous labor she spent her entire adolescence mocking me for doing. I did not move into the historic Newport mansion. I did not assume the role of the coastal matriarch. Instead, I purchased the modest two-bedroom townhouse in Warwick I had always wanted. It has scuffed oak floors, a bay window facing a quiet suburban street, and a tiny backyard where I drink my morning coffee in total peace. I still work as a healthcare data analyst at the hospital in Providence. I kept my demanding job because I genuinely love the work. I enjoy hunting down systemic inefficiencies and streamlining complex databases. The only difference now is that when I leave the office on Friday evening, I do not drive down the coast to untangle someone else's financial mess for free. My weekends belong entirely to me. I want to be completely honest with you here at the end. Standing in that grand dining room, watching my father's face collapse and listening to my sister scream, I did not feel a soaring sense of victorious triumph. I felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. This was not a television drama where the villain is vanquished and everyone lives happily ever after. These were the people I had loved for my entire life. But I learned a crucial foundational lesson that evening in Newport. I learned that loyalty to your family should never require your total self-destruction. I spent 31 years believing that endurance was the exact same thing as love. I thought that saying yes to every demand, silently absorbing every insult, and co-signing away my financial stability was simply what a good, dedicated daughter was supposed to do. I believed that if I just worked hard enough in the shadows, my parents would eventually turn around and offer me the respect I desperately craved. I was wrong. Toxic people do not respect silent endurance. They view it as permission to continue exploiting you. They will drain your resources, isolate you from your peers, and destroy your professional credibility if it means protecting their own fragile egos. A boundary is not a wall designed to keep people out. It is a door. You get to choose who walks through it, and you possess the absolute right to lock it when someone proves they cannot be trusted. Setting a firm boundary is not an act of cruelty or betrayal. It is a fundamental act of survival. If you are currently trapped in a situation similar to mine, if someone in your life is utilizing love as currency, trading basic affection for your compliance, and making you feel immense guilt for simply protecting your own future, I need you to hear this clearly. Saying no does not make you ungrateful. Refusing to co-sign a loan does not make you a bad child. Defending your professional reputation against fabricated rumors does not make you crazy or unstable. It makes you someone who has finally decided that their own life actually matters. If someone is using you as a foundation, treating you like a solid bridge designed solely for them to walk all over, you have to let them see what happens when you decide to stand up. You must stop waiting for them to acknowledge your worth. You have to arm yourself with undeniable facts, secure your legal standing, and force them to confront the reality of their own actions. That is my story. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Your time means more to me than you know. If this narrative resonated with you, if you have ever had to choose between keeping a toxic peace and maintaining your own dignity, I would love to hear from you. What would you have done with that heavy red folder? Would you have stayed quiet to protect the family image? Or would you have dropped it right in the center of the mahogany table? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want another story about reclaiming your power, there is a link in the description to a video I think will stay with you just as long. Hit like, subscribe to Jessica Told Stories, and I will see you in the next one. There is a pervasive myth woven deeply into the fabric of American culture. One that sits quietly at the head of our holiday tables and hides securely behind the manicured hedges of our suburban neighborhoods. It is the belief that a family's legacy is measured by what they accumulate. The sprawling estates, the successful businesses, the polished social standing within the community. We are taught to revere the traditional family structure as an impenetrable fortress of unconditional love and protection. Yet as the story of the daughter who dropped the heavy red folder onto her parents' mahogany dining table so devastatingly illustrates, a fortress built on deception, favoritism, and financial exploitation is not a sanctuary. It is a prison. When we reflect on the spectacular collapse of that Newport maritime empire, we are not merely looking at a corporate hostile takeover. We are witnessing the tragic, inevitable harvest of fundamentally broken parenting. Raising children is the most profound moral responsibility a human being can undertake. It requires far more than providing food, shelter, or a prestigious zip code. True parenting demands an unwavering commitment to honesty, an absolute dedication to fairness, and a deep, empathetic, emotional awareness. When parents abandon these core values in pursuit of status or ego, they do not just fail their children. They actively dismantle the very soul of their family. In traditional American family dynamics, there is often a dangerous temptation to assign roles. We see the creation of the golden child, the one groomed for the spotlight, shielded from consequences, and showered with unearned praise. And in the shadows, we find the invisible workhorse, the child relied upon to carry the burdens, balance the ledgers, and absorb the quiet daily cruelties of neglect. This dynamic is a catastrophic failure of long-term guidance. When a mother and father prioritize the illusion of a perfect family over the actual well-being of their children, they teach them that love is entirely transactional. They teach the golden child that they are above accountability, fostering an arrogance that eventually leads to their own ruin. Conversely, they teach the invisible child that their worth is solely tethered to their utility. But the deepest tragedy lies in the fact that these parents genuinely believe they are protecting the family. They gaslight the responsible child, orchestrate elaborate smear campaigns, and harbor undeniable thieves, all under the delusion that keeping the family image intact is the ultimate moral good. They mistake control for guidance, and they confuse silence with peace. True family responsibility requires the emotional courage to look at your children as distinct, independent individuals rather than extensions of your own ego. It means holding the ones you love accountable, even when it is socially inconvenient or personally embarrassing. If a parent sacrifices one child's financial future to subsidize another child's luxury, they are not building a legacy. They are constructing a tragedy. Honesty is not merely the act of telling the truth. It is the practice of living in reality. Fairness is not always about equal distribution of assets. It is about the equal distribution of respect. When these pillars are absent, the traditional family structure rots from the inside out, leaving nothing but a hollow shell waiting for the slightest breeze to knock it down. We are culturally conditioned to endure. Generation after generation, we are handed the dangerous narrative that endurance is the exact same thing as love. We are told that blood is thicker than water, that family is everything, and that forgiveness is a mandatory toll we must pay simply to keep our seat at the dinner table. We are taught to absorb the pain, to co-sign the loans, to smile through the insults, and to keep the peace at all costs. But what if the most profound lesson a parent can impart is not how to endure suffering, but how to absolutely refuse it? If you are navigating the murky, often treacherous waters of family dynamics, or if you simply appreciate narratives that dig past the superficial layers of our lives to expose the raw, beating heart beneath, I encourage you to hit like and subscribe to Jessica Told Stories. We explore the stories that force us to look in the mirror, the ones that challenge the comfortable lies we tell ourselves in the dark. Here is the truth that goes against everything polite society tries to drill into our heads. Walking away from your family is not always a failure of love. Sometimes, breaking the table apart is the highest, most pure realization of moral clarity. We are taught that loyalty means standing by your family no matter what. But blind loyalty to a toxic system is merely complicity in your own destruction. The protagonist of our story did not dismantle her family out of malice. She dismantled it because the architecture was already deeply corrupt. She learned a lesson her parents were too cowardly to teach her. A boundary is not a betrayal. It is an act of survival. Parenting should ultimately be the practice of working yourself out of a job. It is about equipping a child with a spine strong enough to stand entirely on their own, a moral compass calibrated to the truth, and a heart brave enough to demand the respect they deserve. If a parent fails to do this, the child must eventually parent themselves. They must learn to set their own table and realize that they alone dictate who is worthy of a seat. The blood in your veins is an origin. It is not an obligation. You do not owe your future to the people who supplied your past, especially if they attempt to use your love as a weapon against you. The most enduring legacy you can possibly leave behind in this world is not a company, a mansion, or a flawless reputation. It is the undeniable proof that you refused to be consumed by the people who were supposed to protect you. When you look across your own table this holiday season, look closely at the faces staring back at you. Are they holding you up, or are they holding you hostage? And if you suddenly realize you are sitting in the dark, you have to ask yourself the only question that truly matters. Are you going to continue carrying their secrets? Or are you finally going to turn on the light?